Hello, and welcome to the One Question Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of learning and development with leading experts. And I'm your host, Rob Porter, and today we're going to be exploring an intriguing aspect of e-learning technology and leadership development. Today, I'm excited to welcome Scott Pickard-Jones, a seasoned expert in leadership development, workforce strategy, and organizational transformation. With over 20 years of experience, Scott has led high-impact initiatives for federal and state agencies, focusing on career and succession planning, performance management, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Currently, he supports these efforts as a senior specialist in the government and public sector human capital practice at a global consulting firm. Scott, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you asking me.
Oh, of course. So, Scott, and I'll jump right into this. So, with the One Question Podcast, we just kind of really focus on one specific high-level conversation. And the question that we have for you today is, what are some tips on how organizations ensure that their performance management systems are aligned with leadership development and employee growth focused in the government environment?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I appreciate you asking. I'll start by saying, by defining systems. First of all, I look at this as programs as opposed to just the technology you use. But with that, the answer is going to be far more complex than we have time to discuss in this short podcast.
Sure.
So when I'm thinking about TIP, I start out with, first of all, with some qualifications. There is no one-size-fits-all solution that works for every government agency or office. You really need to dig into how the agency arrived at its current state and how its values shape its practices before you can start to address performance management in a real way. You have to build a performance program for the agency's specific context. So with that in mind, I like to look at performance from the human perspective before addressing process. Government roles are often constrained by regulation, politics, historical practice, and union participation.
For sure.
All of those impact performance, right?
Yeah.
So when you're designing programs, you have to think about all that and then address the fact that there's frequently a sense of inertia. Change happens slowly, if at all, within a government employment culture. Think about how things don't change at the DMV or other agencies that you interact with from time to time. Change is usually not often welcomed within the workforce there. So I think about, for example, the enormous changes that were announced last year for FDA, where they are changing the entire structure. People are changing where they sit and who they report to. It's an immense undertaking. There's another agency within the legislative branch where I helped redesign their performance management program, and it always depends on the current context you're working within.
Makes sense.
So with that as a setup,
right.
When I approach performance programs, I generally begin with 5 objectives.
Okay.
To set clear performance expectations, design fair performance assessments, connect quality training to performance needs, to establish regular and frequent performance check-ins, and then never surprise an employee in a performance review. Those 5 objectives.
Those are perfect and very concise.
So let me flesh those out a bit.
Yeah.
First and foremost, you have to be clear on the expectations for the role and what successful achievement looks like. You have to make sure those exceptions fall within the role's span of control. And this is a huge amount of work, just in discovery, but also really putting the pieces together. Job descriptions have to be accurate and they need to be updated regularly. They have to clearly outline what those expectations are. And they are not the responsibility of the employee. Really, they're not the responsibility of the manager. That's HR's job to get in there and make sure that these are updated. And by regularly, I'm talking about a minimum of yearly. Regular confirmation of required tasks and what success looks like really needs to involve the employee in the conversation rather than just the manager. It's essential to getting it right. Then, with that clarity, the employee should have all the necessary authority to make decisions within the scope of their work. So there are a couple of things with that. First of all, managers should coach to performance. They should never um, micromanage. And
Hmm.
coaching to performance is a whole different podcast. Um,
We'll have you
but
back.
yeah, please. Coaching, it can be a lot of fun when it's done well. But when it's effective, the training then help them to put the pieces together to achieve success. It really drives self-motivation. The employee has to have direct influence on the outcomes. So, for example, you can't expect an employee to get better data if that individual is disallowed from requesting the information from the source. So, just as an example, I spoke recently with a consultant who was tasked with creating communications for the client, but
Hmm.
not allowed to speak to him. And then later she was
Yeah.
criticized for not using his voice. Well, how could she possibly, right? So this is a real story.
Yeah,
It's happening in as we speak,
I
right?
believe it. I do.
So her performance is then dinged because she's restrained from having the control she needs or the
Mhm.
influence she needs in order to succeed. So if an employee can't be given any control, any authority or influence on a particular outcome, then that outcome can't be considered a fair expectation of the role.
Sure. No, that makes complete sense.
So there are going to be a lot of it depends in
Hmm.
this situation. Everything depends on the job, but they should be able to offer options to their customer meaning whoever is the recipient of their service, right? They
Yeah.
should be able to offer options if things come up or, how to help that person.
Right.
Expectations also need to be realistic. So, can you say that any reasonable, capable, and properly trained person can do the tasks involved in this role? If there are issues of equity or fairness, these also need to be addressed before the tasks show up on a performance assessment.
Right.
So, all of that is just within addressing expectations, right? Once the expectations are good, then the assessment of their achievement also has to be scrutinized for fairness and equity.
Hmm.
Not all questions are worded in ways that land the same for different groups of people. I was working on a performance assessment years ago where I was working with the manager, and we we thought we had a solid piece. And of course, we sent it to legal, and they actually made us withdraw two questions because it didn't land in one of our um, uh, per, um, what's the word? The protected groups,
Okay.
right?
Sure. Sure.
So
Sure.
making sure that the experts are involved is a best practice. You got to make sure that there are different groups, making sure there isn't a disparate impact on protected groups. So, in creating performance assessments, there's research that shows that simplifying them to a Likert scale response to a statement like, I would always want this person on my team,
Mhm.
or this person deserves the highest pay possible, these tend to give the most accurate accounting of successful performance. It may seem subjective, but it really does work. Um, it again is going to have to be written in such a way that it's specific for the context that you're in, and there may be some uh, more detailed questions within it. But if you can reduce a performance assessment down to two or three statements, so much the better. This makes the performance process management, the performance management process rather, less burdensome on the managers and supervisors. So
It
when you go ahead,
I was just going to say, I mean, a couple things that I'm just kind of picking up. I think one is just the communication side of this. It's really about empowering the employee to be. It's a participation sport, right?
totally,
You're not on the sidelines, and it's the difference between having talking to someone or talking with someone.
absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely, and this is where coaching comes in, and we'll get to that in just a second.
sure.
Um, But yes, you're absolutely right. This becomes a collaborative effort with the employee. So, on the other hand, for those organizations that have really intense and detailed performance assessments and reporting requirements, generally what ends up happening is that those managers or supervisors are required to fill out long forms, and they have to remember what happened last year or earlier this year. And it
Sure.
makes it really difficult. It puts the onus on them to become good writers. And that's not an issue of performance.
Right.
Instead, to your point, when you're coaching the employee and they are involved in this, they will continue to engage and make everything better. So will the manager. So performance management programs are never a one and done effort. It's going to be iterative, it's going to change over time, and it should, because the needs of the workers within the context of the agency is going to change, perhaps little by little, but it does change. So there's going to be differences for different positions, different levels, but this is really a good place to start when it comes to creating performance assessments. When we talk about training, you have to make sure your employees have access to training. They know what that training is, how it's going to build their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And it's all based on what you said success looks like. So when
Sure.
you're doing this, you want to make sure that performance and training systems are communicating with one another. That can be a real problem when you've got completely different vendors on each of those systems, the platforms. You have to make sure that one is communicating with the other so that you can actually map the training to performance gaps.
Right. Yeah.
If you can automate that, great. If a certain, you have a list of skills or competencies that are in the system and they're tied to the actual training, so that when I come in with my performance assessment and I'm showing gaps in my knowledge or skills, the system will automatically pull the right training for me so that I know how to build those.
It,
Then, when it comes to the coaching, I also have to determine, if I'm setting up the program, who's responsible for coaching this person? Is it the manager? Is it somebody else? Because performance is a shared responsibility. It's
right.
never, no one is performing or succeeding in a vacuum. They're never doing it alone.
Sure.
Somebody else needs to be involved.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And as far as, the aligning the skills, I mean, that's an art in itself. I think
Oh, it
is,
is.
just as far as that goes. And I really hear you from the point of making sure that they have access and they know the path. They know how to get there. They know
Right.
what they need to do. And I think it's a big part of that. It goes back to what you mentioned earlier about communication.
Absolutely. It's funny because there are a lot of organizations who say that you, the employee, are responsible for your own career.
Hmm.
And that's a red flag for me, or a cautionary flag, yellow flag for me.
Sure.
Because basically what it's saying is we are not going to take responsibility to help you through. Now, I've also worked with companies where you're given a coach. That somebody is assigned to you to make sure that you have the help that you need in knowing what success looks like. How do you get the opportunities to grow your skills and all
Right.
those? That's the way to do that. But
Hmm.
that comes back to coaching.
Well, Scott, again, man, I really appreciate you being here, and it's clear as far as some of the approaches for performance management. Being clear, setting those expectations, right? Making sure that you communicate extremely
Right.
well. Set up that process as an ongoing process. Is huge, and no surprises, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
No
uh,
surprises.
no
Don't surprise your
surprises
people.
at all. So thanks again. I definitely want to have you on the podcast again. So again, thank you for being
You're
here.
welcome. I'll
All
happy
right.
to come back.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much. And then for everyone else, we really appreciate you being here. By all means, we're going to have a poll up on our LinkedIn page. We'd love to hear any thoughts and ideas that you may have. And then check us again for another episode of the One Question Podcast. Thank you.